To do what you believe is right, that is the courage to publish. And if we don't hold a line for freedom of the press, then who will? That was Katharine Graham from Personal History, 1997. Graham's words reflect the extraordinary pressure she faced, not just as a publisher, but as a woman leading a major newspaper in a male dominated world. Her decision to publish the Pentagon Papers wasn't just about journalistic freedom, it was about moral responsibility. The Post dramatizes that crossroads moment when the pursuit of truth risks everything. And that's what today's episode is all about.
Welcome back to APUSH for All. Today we're digging into Steven Spielberg's The Post, a film that dramatizes the Washington Post race to publish the Pentagon Papers in 1971. But this isn't just a story about newspapers, it's about power, and it's about trust in government. It's also really forcing us to think about the First Amendment and what happens when the institutions of democracy are tested by secrecy and war.
Yeah, and the two main characters in this film, and now they're historical figures, are publisher Katharine Graham, who's played by the incomparable Meryl Streep. As was once said in an episode of Modern Family, Meryl Streep could play Batman and would still be the right choice.
True that.
And then editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, and he's played by Tom Hanks. But it's more than just a scoop, a journalistic scoop. It is about the evolving role of the press in a democracy, especially during times of national crisis.
So we're going to start with historical context, as always. So we're talking Vietnam War, the Cold War mindset, and then just the cultural crisis of the late 1960s. And then we're going to explore the broader APUSH themes. So we'll look at the role of government power, civic activism, gender and leadership, and the meaning of constitutional rights under pressure. Of course, we're going to bring this all home with some modern day echoes. Stick around, should be a good episode.
So, to understand what's at stake in the Post, we need to go back to 1967. That's when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a top secret government study tracing the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And I think a lot of people don't realize how far back you go when we talk about colonialism in Vietnam and U.S. involvement. It covers from Truman all the way up to LBJ. Over 23 years, over 20 years, 23, that was kind of oddly specific, policymaking, deception, and what we'll call mission creep. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was an internal government history. 7,000 pages painted a damning picture that American leaders knew the war was unwinnable, but kept escalating it anyway to avoid political fallout.
It's interesting that McNamara even wanted this study in the first place. He's an academic, and so you can understand how an academic thought that it would be important for posterity to go back and see the steps that got us there. But I don't think he ever anticipated that the papers would be used in such a way. But that's exactly what happens. And these, as it becomes to be known, these Pentagon Papers reveal this long history that most Americans really had no clue about. And so one of the men who works on this study, the study that McNamara put together, is Daniel Ellsberg. And initially, Ellsberg, like many Americans, supported the war based on what his country had told him. But when he saw the lies stack up, and he himself witnessed the toll it was taking on both Vietnamese citizens and American soldiers, he had a change of heart. And so in 1971, he makes a pretty radical decision. He decides to copy these classified documents and then looks for a way to leak them to the press. He tries to go through proper channels. He approached a few members of Congress, including United States Senator William Fulbright, but no one was willing to kind of bring the truth to light, to reveal these documents to the public. So then he goes to the press, and specifically the New York Times.
Yeah, and I was wondering this while I was watching the film. They just call it the Pentagon Papers. That's just a name that's been adopted over time, and I think it was adopted in the early 70s too, just, all of these documents coming out of the Department of Defense, which is of course housed in the Pentagon. So, fun fact. So once Ellsberg gives a portion of these documents to the New York Times, the stakes really start to skyrocket because these are classified documents of the United States government. And on June 13th, 1971, the New York Times published the first installment of what it called, quote unquote, a massive study of how the United States went to war in Indochina. Indochina, of course, being Vietnam. And Nixon, the president at that time, his Justice Department quickly responded by demanding the paper cease to publish anything related to these government documents. And they cited the Espionage Act, which claimed that national security was at risk. And of course, this comes all the way from World War I in 1917, when the government was concerned that all of these hyphenated Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, would potentially be against the U.S. war effort, whether that was true or it was just perception. So they go all the way back to that. And after 3 installments that the New York Times published, a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order against the Times. And this was the first time in American history that the federal government had censored a major newspaper. So it's a huge deal.
So that's when the Washington Post then enters the story. While the film centers on the Post, it's worth remembering that they were not the first, but they were pivotal. Ellsberg, by then in hiding, had also given the documents to other outlets, including the Post, just in case the Times was silenced. And now it was up to the publisher, Katharine Graham, to decide whether to take the same risk.
And as the film goes to great lengths to emphasize, this was truly an enormous risk. Graham's legal team warns her that she could be charged under this Espionage Act. Her company's pending stock sale could collapse. That was a big, point of tension in the film, where she, as a woman publisher, is trying to hold together this family newspaper, and the way that this could happen is if the Post could go up to sell some of the stocks at a public offering. But now that's all at risk too. And at the end of the day, she could go to jail. Everyone involved, the editors, lawyers, family, friends, were telling her to really think carefully and potentially act conservatively here. But ultimately, she gives the go-ahead to publish. And in her memoir, Personal History, that Mr. Hill quoted from at the beginning of the pod, we hear those words reflect the weight of that decision, where she says, quote, "There are some things worth risking your company and your freedom for. And for me, the First Amendment was one of them."
Snaps.
Yeah, indeed, for the First Amendment.
And that decision to publish propelled the case toward the U.S. Supreme Court. Within days, the legal battle became known as the New York Times Company versus the United States, with the Washington Post later added as a co-defendant along with the New York Times. And the question before the court was, could the federal government stop a newspaper from publishing classified material on the grounds of national security?
And that is a sticky question, right? So the Nixon administration, who had already gained the notoriety of being unbelievably what's the right word for Nixon?
Well, he was a paranoid guy.
I guess paranoid
Yeah.
was the word I was looking for.
Paranoid
Yeah,
style.
Yeah.
Paranoid, and I would say someone who really wanted to control as much as he possibly could.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you could say he was a big believer in the power of the executive branch.
Right.
Oh, yeah. The
Right.
imperial presidency.
And he thought, if the papers were published, that this was going to cause irreparable harm. But the court was not convinced, and the ruling actually was a 6-3 ruling that the justices sided with the press. Justice Hugo Black's concurring opinion is worth quoting here. Quote, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people." This is, and I've often heard it quoted that a free press is like the fourth branch of government.
Sure.
It has to be seen in that light.
Another line from that decision that I love that they mention in the movie is the press was to serve the governed, not the governors. And I think, that is such an important line at any point in American history, in the past, the present, the future. We have to remember that that is such a cornerstone of American democracy.
Right, and I think any discussion on why democracies or nations fail starts with the first step, usually, or the first domino to fall, is the ending of a free press.
Hmm.
When the press dies, suddenly there's a lot of shadows cast, and that allows for powerful figures to operate in the dark. And by the time it's gone too far, by the time people find out about it, it's gone too far, and there's nothing to really do to stop it.
Well, it's funny you use those metaphors because the line, the slogan of the Washington Post is democracy dies in darkness.
That's right. I think maybe I subconsciously knew that. When you have,
Maybe I'm just smarter than you.
I think when you have so much information in your brain, you are able to develop metaphors on the spot
Yeah.
in such a way that it aligns with powerful national newspapers. I don't know. That's just me speculating. Okay, so
Deep breath.
the ruling, I also think this is important. The ruling reaffirmed this concept of prior restraint. So those students who are maybe going to be taking AP Gov in the near future, you'll spend a lot of time not only on the New York Times case, but on this concept of prior restraint, which is the idea that if the government attempts to stop publication before it actually happens, that is almost never constitutional. And it marks one of the most important victories for the press, the freedom of the press, really, in American history.
I think it's really important that we discuss Katharine Graham's unique role in all of this, given her status as a woman at a time where they were still considered, vastly inferior to men, especially within the business world, the world of academia. And we really can't overlook what she did. She wasn't just making a journalistic decision, she was navigating a deeply gendered power structure. And she was the only woman in a room full of powerful men, lawyers, board members, editors, government officials, you name it. And for most of her early career, she was underestimated or treated as a figurehead. And the movie, there's a few scenes where Meryl Streep, she's either talking with her daughter, there's one scene where she's talking with her daughter and she's saying, when the paper was passed on to my husband, I felt that that was natural. I didn't have any feelings of animosity about that in the 1950s because that's just how it was. I didn't expect for my father to hand the paper to me. Of course it went to my husband, and he was brilliant, he was great, but now the 70s, after the women's movement of the 60s, it's women are starting to realize, the way of the past doesn't have to be the way of the future. And in her memoir, she wrote, I had always felt that I was not entitled to be where I was. When I walked into meetings, I was terrified people would find out I didn't belong. And I think so many women feel that way still today. I mean, these, intrusive thoughts. And I think men feel that same way too. But, certainly women, feel like they, despite their qualifications, despite their merits, despite how hard they've worked, there can be a lot of those types of feelings. And that sense of imposter syndrome, it's still very real today.
And watching Meryl Streep work as a professional in that capacity, it was those scenes where you could feel that terror that she was, exuding, she walked into, and she was the one in charge or supposed to be in charge. It was supposed to be her decisions were the one that you would, the ones that you would go with. But that feeling, just unbelievable acting ability. But it was, I think for audiences today, it was cringy to see how she was kind of shunted to the side, either really subtly or not so subtly in those scenes. Um, so her decision absolutely changes the landscape. Her courage in that moment wasn't just about publishing the papers, it was about stepping fully into her authority. She turned the Washington Post into a national paper of record and laid the groundwork for its later role in when Watergate bursts onto the scene, which would unfold only a year later.
Yeah, and I think for our APUSH students or anyone interested in American history, this movie reveals so much about the time period. So yes, we have this moment where a lot of really highly educated, highly intelligent women are starting to question the traditional structure of society and say, well, wait a second, I can make these decisions. I did go to an elite college. I did work my butt off to do something with my life, and it wasn't just to be on the sidelines. So we have that happening in the 1960s. We also have this moment where the Constitution is being put to the test, and the limits and the power of the Constitution are up for national debate. And we really see how individuals intersect with institutional change and contingency. How these things play out really comes down to a moment of courage. And that's what makes it such a compelling story that I think a lot of our students definitely bought into and enjoyed.
Well, I love the idea of contingency too. I think that is so important in any historical event. And, a 6-3 decision, what if the Supreme Court makeup had been different? I always think about that with every Supreme Court case. It's like it, it could change and the decision would be different. And so, you know,
Yeah, this wasn't a 9 to 0 slam dunk case.
right?
Um, and I think, it's not as if we've closed the door on this. The idea that the federal government needs to do things that the public doesn't know about, I think a lot of people would, in some instances, agree with that or be okay with that. And there's still a lot of Americans, a lot of politicians who maybe wouldn't fully agree with this 6-3 decision. So it's not as if we're done with this type of debate. So the Supreme Court decision in 1971 didn't just protect the Post and the New York Times. It became, as we've been basically laying out, a constitutional landmark and one of the strongest affirmations of First Amendment protections in American history. So that ruling obviously reverberates through every conversation we still have today about the press, freedom of the press, national security, and the role of journalism in a democracy.
And think about modern parallels. We've seen cases in our lifetimes involving classified leaks, from Edward Snowden's release of NSA surveillance programs put in place during the Patriot Act after 9/11, to Chelsea Manning's disclosures through WikiLeaks, to journalists publishing sensitive materials about drone programs, military operations, or intelligence findings. And in every case, the core question really echoes the Pentagon Papers. Does the public's right to know outweigh the government's claim to secrecy?
And are these people that you just mentioned, Ms. Kellner, are these people heroes or villains?
Yeah.
Right? And it really depends on who you ask. And in those modern debates, it's always the New York Times versus the United States case that gets cited over and over again. The court's majority held that the government must meet an extraordinarily heavy burden to justify prior restraint. That standard still protects journalists who publish information that challenges the state. It means the government can prosecute leakers, but it almost never can silence the press.
And that distinction really matters because Daniel Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act. And just like Snowden and Manning, they were found guilty. So the Washington Post, though, and the New York Times, they weren't. And the reason for that is the press, as the court ruled, it exists to inform the people, not to serve as a passive extension of the government. So the tension between national security and press freedom remains one of the defining legal and ethical dilemmas of modern American democracy.
And I think it's important to, remember that Ellsberg, he was never imprisoned. Actually, the charges against him were dropped. And that had a lot to do with the Nixon administration illegally wiretapping his psychiatrist's office. So again, like going back to how paranoid and in control Nixon always had to be. So, there is a deeper issue here, and that is trust. And the Pentagon Papers marked a turning point in how Americans viewed their government. And after the publication, trust in federal institutions plummeted. And this was only the beginning because, as we mentioned earlier, Watergate is going to happen just about a year later, only deepening that crisis. And you could still argue that we're living in that shadow of the moment where public skepticism about truth and leadership and media is, the default. I feel like anytime, something happens that inconveniences any one of us, who pick a leader who's in office and just say, oh, thanks, so and so. And people before the 70s had a lot of faith in their government. And whether that was right or wrong, I'm sure there were many instances throughout American history where the public should have been told more than they were. But this is also going to lead to a political divide too, and increased political polarization.
Yeah, we see just a little bit of that going on right now. We are definitely living in the shadow of that moment, as you said. And if the Pentagon Papers sparked a golden age of investigative journalism, then today's media environment poses new challenges, as you portended a second ago, with 24-hour news cycles, partisan outlets, disinformation campaigns. The stakes have changed, but the principle has not. The First Amendment is still the foundation of democratic accountability.
And the First Amendment is more than a civics class slogan. We often, students will proclaim First Amendment rights, but what does it really mean? Well, it's a living framework, and it has to be defended case by case, decision by decision. And that's really the legacy of the Post, as well as the New York Times versus United States Supreme Court case, is even in moments of fear, even when the stakes are high, democratic institutions can work if people are willing to take the risk. So in that vein that we were working in before we had our little break, let's talk about the legacy of the Post and the Pentagon Papers in today's actual cases that we see playing out in modern times. Because as we navigate new challenges with freedom of the press in the digital age, recent events continue to highlight the ever-evolving landscape of First Amendment rights and the press's role in holding power to account.
One notable case is the Associated Press versus Budowich, where the Associated Press sued the Trump administration for barring its reporters from White House events due to the Associated Press's refusal to use the term Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico. And the Associated Press argues that this action violates the First Amendment's protection of press freedom and the Fifth Amendment's due process clause. And the case is currently pending in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit.
So this situation underscores the tension between government authority and journalistic independence. The administration's attempt to dictate language usage raises concerns about censorship and the press's ability to report freely.
Another significant development is the mass termination of nearly 600 contractors at Voice of America, also known as the VOA, by the Trump administration in May of 2025. And these layoffs, which were primarily affecting foreign journalists who were on J-1 visas, have raised concerns about the potential deportation of reporters to countries where they may face persecution. Critics argued that this move undermines VOA's mission to promote press freedom globally and could have a chilling effect on journalistic independence.
So, in a related development, the Department of Justice rescinded a policy that had previously restricted the subpoenaing,
I think you got
the
it.
subpoenaing of journalistic records. This change, announced in April of 2025, allows for increased surveillance of reporters, sparking criticism from press freedom advocates who warn that it could deter investigative journalism and compromise the confidentiality. Well, I'm really tripping over all
It's a
kinds
tough
of.
word.
It's multisyllabic. These words.
Confidentiality
of sources.
You know, this reminds me, let's go back to the progressive era. That was one of our first episodes this semester, and how the progressive era really came about was through the
Press.
the muckrakers.
Muckrakers.
And so, if you want to fix problems in society, if you want to bring things to light, it's difficult. It can be painful. It can be uncomfortable, but it is really necessary.
That's a great point of continuity. Although you could also find.
Wait, did he just say I made a great point?
You did.
But I say that only so that I can now make a counterpoint.
Oh boy.
So the counterpoint would
Does this
be,
have something to do with Mark Twain?
No,
Okay.
but it could.
All right.
Homme
Okay.
de plume.
I think what's interesting about what Ms. Keltner said, 100% correct, but note that the muckrakers were often lionized and celebrated. They wrote best-selling pieces. They were held up as these paragons of democracy, and we still talk about, we say their names and we know what they accomplished. And
it is a great point.
Well, thank you.
What a great point.
When you get to the 60s and 70s, journalists are also celebrated. Think about the fact that we watch a movie. This movie is all about journalists and how they brought down really a level of corruption in the federal government. Or think about Watergate. The two political reporters who the movies were made about these people. They're celebrated. They write books. They do all kinds of great stuff.
And
right?
typically, in what other era would the common American person know who Woodward and Bernstein
Exactly.
were? They're reporters' names.
Yeah.
And everybody knows who they were associated with. And to your point about the progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt, who historically speaking, is one of the most progressive presidents, especially given the context in which he was in power. He even thought that muckraking went too far. In fact, it was Roosevelt who, he didn't coin the term per se, but he used it in a pejorative way to describe investigative journalism, because he thought, why can't you just look up and see all the good things? You have to constantly, investigative journalists, have to constantly be raking the muck. And so here he is, a progressive president, but and not always really happy about investigative journalism. Both of those things, side by side, are what define the progressive era.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
And it's the muckrakers, though, who come out on top, taking that term and really turning it against Roosevelt and those who were critical. But then my point, I think, that I'm finally getting to after all this time is
land the plane
here. I don't think today we quite have such widespread regard for journalists like we once did.
Right.
And in fact, some have argued that journalists are the bad guys. They're the villains in the room. We've seen stories where reporters are booed and threatened at political events. We've seen instances where journalists are called liars, that they're the corrupt media, and it's almost as if the tables have turned on the very reporters and journalists who are supposed to be keeping us the most free.
I think a big mistake that so many people make is lumping true investigative journalists in when they say, the media, and then they follow it with something negative, because true investigative journalism is so crucial to American democracy, and it's not supposed to be political in one way or another. It is, supposed to, if a Democrat is president, it's supposed to ensure that the truth is being told about that administration. If a Republican is in office, it is supposed to ensure that the truth is being exposed and told about that administration. So, this professional, really well educated, very ethical class of journalists it's so necessary.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right that they get lumped in with the 24-hour news cycle where you have pundits who are 100% speaking to an audience and trying to capture that audience. That's very different from the people who spend weeks and months and even years investigating and trying to uncover the truth.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to make that distinction. But sadly, public perception of press freedom is continuing to shift in the wrong direction. A Pew Research Center survey found that while 70% of Americans remain concerned about potential restrictions on press freedoms, partisan views have flipped since 2024, indicating a growing polarization in how press freedom is perceived. And these developments remind us that the principles upheld during the Pentagon Papers era are still being tested. The press's role in a democracy requires constant vigilance to ensure that freedom of expression and the right to information are preserved.
All right, you finally landed the plane. So let's talk about some summaries and takeaways. This episode connects with several big APUSH themes: politics and power, culture and society, American identity, and America in the world. And it really highlights a turning point in the relationship between citizens, media, and the state. A moment when the institutions of American democracy were really tested not by enemies abroad, but by secrecy at home.
And the Post captures that test not through sweeping battle scenes or grand speeches, but through conversations in kitchens, tense boardrooms, and clattering newsrooms. The stakes are constitutional, but the drama is personal. And it's about a woman finding her voice, an editor choosing principle over protection, and a free press deciding when enough is enough.
What is your guys' favorite scene or thing from this movie? And I'll start with mine.
Okay.
It's not just one thing. It is Meryl Streep throughout the entire movie, and her glasses. She's constantly taking the glasses on and off, constantly playing with them in her hands in a way that is just brilliant. I can't even describe it. You have to watch the movie if you haven't seen it. Meryl Streep is just this was her last Oscar nomination. She hasn't gotten one since this in 2018. She didn't win, but she's got like the most most Oscar nominations, I think, of any woman in history. And just the way that she can even hold a prop such as glasses, and she makes it look so natural. Like, I see you taking your glasses on and off.
Yeah,
You're not acting.
And a lot of people think I'm Meryl Streep.
People have said that.
They're like,
Because of
God,
that.
look at the way he's doing that. That is so Streepish.
Streepish. I was going to say Streepian. You said Streepish.
Hey, you're looking a little streepish today. Everything
Streepish.
okay?
Everything okay?
All right,
Why the Streepish face?
My favorite scene is when they show all the steps involved in making a newspaper. So I stopped the movie there and I said, just everybody consider for a second the industry that was created just to make a newspaper. Because they show, like, even in the 1970s, they're having to, like, individually put all the little tiles into the newspaper, how mechanized it was to make that many newspapers in a short span of time. And it's just pretty amazing that that's what it took for people to be informed. Now, just a click of the button and digitally, it's all.
And not
there.
only that, most major newspapers, there was a morning and an evening edition. And so times two.
Yeah.
Right?
The editing with pencil on paper.
That was cool.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, it does a great job of showing how necessary, but also how difficult it was for people to be informed.
Yeah.
And now I think we really take that. We almost have too much information and we have a hard time deciding
Oh yeah, definitely.
what we should listen to. Back then it was just having access to a newspaper was critical, and it was not an easy thing to do.
I think what the whole setup for the movie obviously is Ellsberg's like that, and you can see it in the scene where it dawns on him for the first time when he's on the airplane at the very beginning of the movie. and he's come back from Vietnam, where he was embedded, and he's seen all the carnage and everything, and then he's called to come to talk to Secretary McNamara about how do we spin this, blah blah blah. And McNamara is very much like, this is not going well. This is a bleep show. Blah blah blah. And then I was gonna say something else, but I know this is a family show.
Bleep show.
Bleep show. I was being very streepish when I said that. But then he gets off the plane, and McNamara is giving this press conference, and he's like, "Yeah, things are going as planned. I think we're very optimistic about the future." And the look on is it Jonathan Rhys who is
Replace him? Yeah.
he turns, the look on his face. He turns around, and it's at that moment that he's just like, I think I know what I have to do. And he decided in that moment, it's like transparency for the public will outstrip any kind of government security, and this is the way it has to be.
Yeah.
So as stated before, history doesn't just happen in wars and elections. It happens in courtrooms, and it happens in newsrooms, and in the decisions made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. The Post reminds us that the truth often hangs in the balance, and publishing it can change the course of American history.
So let's go ahead and sign off here on this final APUSH Goes to the Movies episode for now.
Right.
We'll be back again. But for now, just want to say thanks for tuning in to APUSH for All. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or YouTube. Leave us a review. If you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.